Hello everybody and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. I am your host and game master for the time being, as always. And as I already announced during this week's story episode, this week's DM Advice episode is going to be published in 2 parts on YouTube this week. I'm doing this so that my DM Advice episodes can be a little shorter and easier to digest, but I realize this makes posting podcast episodes of this type as one episode a little problematic. It works this week because this week's DM Advice episode divides nicely into 2 parts, but that won't be the case every week, nor should it be. So, starting next week, I'm going to start uploading my DM Advice episodes to podcast platforms as well as YouTube in 2 parts. That way, no matter how you listen to the show, you'll still be getting 3 episodes a week. Again, don't worry, you will not have to have listened to one to understand the other. They will still be standalones. They will just cover basically kind of the same general topic, just different parts of the general topic. And as a result of all of this, I'll probably start experimenting with uploading episodes on different days throughout the week instead of just dumping them all on the same day. As always, if you're listening to this on YouTube, feel free to let me know what you think of this plan in the comments. But until then, let's move on to the episode. As I said last week, I'm going to go back to my series on running a smooth game, and I'm going to go back over my 3-part encounter structure that I mentioned in my episode on how I structured encounters. In this episode, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail over what each part actually is, and then in the second part, I'm going to talk about what can go wrong if you leave each part out, what to look for, and how to fix it. So let's learn something. First and foremost, I should probably do a brief overview of what this structure is and why I use it. Well, many years ago, I realized that some of my encounters kept falling short, and this really wrinkled up my plans and slowed the game down. My players would either completely bypass my plans, not really have any clear goal or know what to do, or even worse, get really confused about what the whole encounter was about in the first place. Now, I want to make something clear, this wasn't a constant thing, but I couldn't help but pay attention to when it did happen. And I eventually realized why, and I came up with a theory and then decided to test that theory. I tested it by using it, and it hasn't failed me yet. Now, so what is this theory? It's that a good encounter has 3 parts: the hook, the action, and the goal. Just like we did on my episode on encounters, start with the hook. The hook is the easiest part. Often, we just do this naturally, but for me, this makes it the hardest to really pin down as well. Essentially, it's whatever lures your players in and gets them started on whatever quest you have for them. You can go with the basic tried and true secretive guy in a tavern and simply tell them what needs to be done, or you can also have them see something happen that spurs them on into action, and that last one can be a little trickier. You need to know for one thing, that they just may not do it, and for another, what will call your particular players to action. You need to have a good sense of your player character's motivations and their values. And remember that point, because it will come up in my next point too, and you'll see why when I get there. But for now, how can you do this in your own games? Well, the short answer is, it depends, but chances are that isn't very useful, so it depends on what. In my games, the kind of hooks I use depend greatly on how relevant and how important to the quest or upcoming adventure, whatever encounter you have your players going through, is or is supposed to be. For example, if your campaign is about hunting down a bad guy who is robbing a bunch of merchant banks, and your first quest for your players is to escort some really important valuable item for someone to one such bank, where the bad guy will happen to be at this point in time, thus introducing the party to them, that's pretty important, I'd say. In cases like this, I'd probably lean more toward the first option that I presented earlier. Be direct, be clear, and be concise. Don't confuse your players. I also want to bring some attention to the criteria that I used. Remember when I said that the kind of a hook you use depends on how important the quest or adventure is? That's really important. The quest may seem super important for one reason. You may be escorting something super important, but the overall adventure is more relevant to the overall plot. What I'm trying to say here is that even in cases where the quest doesn't seem all that important, if the adventure is, and it's something you want your players to do, try to use those more direct methods. And again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but their values and their motivations to nudge them in that direction. Make sure the quests appear really important on the outset, and then hit it with a twist later on. If they don't, and if they still bypass it, that's fine. Just like I said before in that episode on encounters, this is another kind of hook. Chances are you have other quests and things that they will do and that you can be a little creative with and work your plans into. Just like I said in my most recent episode in this series on running a smooth game, you have to constantly be making these little kinds of changes and paying attention to and pivoting based on what your players do. I've been focusing here a lot on main and important quests and adventures and such, but what about stock encounters and those little fun little run-ins that aren't exactly related to the main story? Well, I like to be a little bit more creative with those. Just throw something interesting in front of your players and see what they do. I try to make all my little throwaway encounters have something something in them relevant to the overall story, but nothing that I commit myself to. It's bad practice to put something in front of your players that they need, then them just not do it, and then later on say, aha, you didn't do this really obscure thing earlier, and now you're stuck for it. But you can put little things in front of your players that just add a little bit to the world. I once had my players going to a catacombs that was to have a bunch of zombies in it. The architect was cursed to live forever, and he ended up forgetting who he was and began wandering about the surroundings. My party came across him as he was selling to no one at all little stone figures that looked alarmingly similar to the zombies that lay inside the catacombs they'd come across later on. They didn't have to come across that. They could have just walked right past him, but they encountered him and added more to the world. Plus, another fun trick is to take a random encounter that ended up really enthralling your players and using it to lead into something necessary. Again, you and your players make this story together. This is yet another reason why you should be paying attention to and modifying your plans and intentions as you go along. Again, I direct you to my story on Bonk. I have a whole playlist dedicated to this story, and I talk more about it in detail in my very first Running a Smooth Game episode, but none of that was planned in the usual sense. Instead, it ended up being better than anything I could have planned on my own. But a good hook isn't the only thing that makes a good encounter that flows smoothly with the rest of your campaign. In fact, it's very closely related to another idea, and that is the goal. Now, in the episode where I first introduced the structure, I commented that talking about the goal second may feel a little like skipping to the end, and it definitely might, but not only is the goal necessary to understand the majority of your encounter or the quest or what have you, but it should also probably be said pretty early on, and set up for pretty early on. This avoids confusion and gives your players clear direction. See what I mean about this point being similar to and closely related with the hook? Now, it's possible to give them one goal and have a plot twist or something else like that, change that goal later on, but at the beginning you need to be simple and clear. This is all very reminiscent of what I said a moment ago about hooks, and I mentioned it more in detail on my episode on adventure hooks, so I'm going to keep this point a little bit brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a goal is and should be, as well as a few elements of a good one before really moving on to the action. So what is the goal? Well, it is whatever the party intends to do, or whatever they intend to get out of whatever they're doing or wherever they're going. In short, it's the reason why they embarked on the quest in the first place, or what keeps them involved if they were just kind of roped into it. You don't want your players just doing things because they feel like you want them to. This really breaks the immersion, and hey, I'm not perfect, this still happens to me, it happens to all of us. Sometimes, yes, it is because the player isn't taking initiative to invest themselves into the game, and is instead being disruptive or sabotaging it or whatever, and I know we've all had at least one so-called problem player who did this in the past, but sometimes, and we have to admit this to ourselves, sometimes it's just because you aren't setting them up to be invested. As I said, players need motivation, and it's up to you to use that motivation to give them a reason to do whatever it is in the story that is required of them. In short, a goal. Of course, if this doesn't work for you or your table or your players, don't force it on them. If you have a player who just prefers to be completely casual about it and is still having fun without disrupting anyone or anything like that, fine, that's great, cool. Try to work in some kind of motivation if you can. Maybe they'll be attached to some NPC or a place, and then tragedy befalls that NPC or place, calling them to action. Now, obviously, don't false advertise for quests, and be sure that you know your players, and if this isn't what your players want, then don't do it. Again, every group is different, and every table is different, just like I said a second ago. But if they do want this, if they do want a more immersive game, then try to use either details from your PC's backstories, your player characters' backstories, and even their personalities. You can use their values, like I said earlier, to make them more or less likely to do certain quests and encounters. This goal not only gives them direction, but also serves as a kind of secondary hook. You let them know in-world outright what the goals and stakes are, and they decide whether or not to do it based on that. And as a last little note on the goal, make sure that it makes sense in context, as you should also do with the hook and many other things in D&D. This greatly helps the game flow more smoothly on a more superficial level, but now for the tricky part. What stops them from achieving the goal? What's the challenge? Put another way, what is the action? Well, the action, as I just alluded to, is the challenge. And so it tries to stop your players from doing whatever it is they set out to do. It tries to stop them from achieving the goal that your hook has given them. Now, obviously, you want your players to succeed, so you're not trying to kill their characters or get them stuck or anything like that. I should certainly hope not. That's just not fair. You just want to present them an opposing force, give them an obstacle for them to get around. If it's combat, the goal might be to win. But if you want a quick look at next week's episode on making combat difficult, give them other goals like run away, get an item, or even stop the bad guy from getting away. If it's a puzzle, be be open to other solutions. Not every solution, obviously. You want there to be some difficulty, but if it's clever and not exactly what you might have expected, at least give them a chance to try. For a little more on puzzles, I'd like to say, in more intense puzzles, be clear about the parameters of the puzzle. For example, I just ran a puzzle where my players were in a factory run by a bunch of mine flayers, where they had a bunch of mind-controlled gnoll workers who would mix chemicals, looking for a certain solution. I had the mine flayers say to the gnolls what the parameters were, and I had my players see signs on the walls and hear these mine flayers say what they said to the gnolls, outlining the order and such for the chemicals, as they snuck around, trying to remain unseen. Then, it was up to them to succeed or the mine flayers had failed and mix the potion. It would open up a portal to the next area they had to go to. They ended up solving it and even charming one of the mine flayers to mix it for them. They solved it, but they also used some of their own creativity, and that's what you want. If your puzzle or combat or whatever gets your players trying to think creatively, try to think outside the box, then you did your job as a DM and you deserve a pat on the back because you did it. Good job. And I also want to say that at the heart of a good action or a good challenge is conflict. As most of us learned in elementary school as young children, there are many types of conflict, but for our purposes, it's either external or internal, and ideally you have a little bit of both. Usually, the more important the encounter, the more internal conflict you want to give your players, but if you see other opportunities, seize them. Don't hold back just because the encounter doesn't seem that important to you on the outset. You never know what it might turn into. The external conflict is the challenge that the players have to overcome that I just mentioned. It is the combat, it is the puzzle, but the internal conflict comes back down to the motivations that I mentioned earlier. What internal factors drive them forward, getting back to the goal, and which ones hold them back? Maybe the site of the bad guy's next attack is in a place where one of your PCs is deeply related to. That is definitely a motivating goal. But to use a really generic example, you can say the bad guy is related to them in some way. You know, the whole Luke, I am your father twist. There are obviously many other ways of doing this. That's just one way to get you thinking, but that is definitely a type of internal conflict that will hold them back and give them a challenge. Pull from their backstories and from their characters' personalities and values and use them to create this conflict. Try to do this for every character, not just one or two, and don't neglect any of them. And even better if you can tie them all together in some way. But that's it for now. My other episode this week is going to narrow in on what can go wrong if you leave out any of these parts. I'll quickly review what they are and then start with the hook before moving on with the goal, and then lastly to the action, as is my custom, which you may by now know. Be sure to check out my story for this week and come back next week for some DM advice on making your combat a little bit more difficult, and a story about a character that I more recently played. As always, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments if you're listening to this on YouTube, and until we meet again, let's learn something.